over time because we got people still streaming in, but we're going to go ahead and get started just so we're not wasting too much time. So this event is brought to you by Ratio Christi. Ratio Christi's mission is to provide philosophical, historical, and scientific reasons for belief in Christ. I'm an assistant director for the chapter here at Liberty. It's an international organization, but we have a chapter here, which is a bit unusual because we're mostly planted in secular universities, and we provide fellowship among Christians for people who are interested in intellectual questions, and then people who are seeking truth, and we try to direct them in the right way, and we try to have honest conversations with them. Our club here is actually a CSER accredited club, so if you join the club here, you can get credits for that. So we do fun things. We'd like to thank the Philosophy Club and Interdisciplinary Studies Department for their support. If you'd like to join the Ratio Christi Club or the Philosophy Club on campus, just let me know and I can direct you to the right people. We would also like to thank all of the professors who have helped reach students in discussing these very important questions. I'm your host. I'm David Ohopsky. As I said, I work as an assistant chapter director here, but I also work in Ratio Christi on the national level. I do chapter director training, academic training, things of that sort. I got some fans here. So I teach theology survey here, so it's systematic theology. Some of you guys are probably in my class. I see a couple. Oh yeah, love you guys. I also manage the School Divinity Academic Journal for students. It's called Eleutheria. If you're interested in getting published in there, come see me. Even if you're not immediately published, it is a great resource for you to learn more about getting into the field, especially if you're interested in teaching in the future or if you're interested in doing research. We even have behavioral studies in there. I know there's a good amount of psych students in here. We're really trying to integrate interdisciplinary aspects to this journal and make the articles involved in there very rigorous. Also, I'd like to talk about how the event is structured. We wanted to give time both to discuss what the topics were, so we're going to discuss postmodernism and the resurrection, obviously, but we also wanted to give you guys some time to ask some questions because both subjects are prominent. One is it's an eternal question, whether Jesus rose from the dead, because it has eternal consequences, and then something is something more ephemeral, something happening now in the current day is postmodernism, and we'll discuss what that is. So you have eternal subjects, you have immediate subjects, and we're trying to bridge these two things together. We're sure you guys are going to have a lot of questions about that. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Dr. Gary Habermas. He is known as the premier scholar on the resurrection of Jesus. His bestsellers include The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus and The Historical Jesus. There's a feast riff that was written, that was released in 2020 called Raised on the Third Day, Defending the Historicity of the Resurrection of Jesus, and that's written in his name. He is one of several contemporary apologists listed in the textbook of the History of Apologetics, and that's a recent textbook that's required for certain courses here, so you'll see his name there. He is also a distinguished research professor of apologetics here at the School of Divinity. So if you guys are interested in getting to know him, he's an amazing resource that Liberty has brought here and kept here for a long time, and we love him at the School of Divinity. And our second speaker is Dr. Stewart Kelly. Kelly is an analytic philosopher and professor at Minot State University in North Dakota. He has written books on critical thinking called Thinking Well, The Nature of Truth called Truth Considered and Applied, and Postmodernism called Understanding Postmodernism. So he's a bit of an expert on that topic as well. And this event is just basically, as I said, an opportunity to equip you guys discerning these questions and seeing how they apply to today. So starting with the dialogue aspect of it, I'm going to start to ask them a few questions. I'll give them time to respond and just discuss. And so we'll start with question number one. What is postmodernism? Dr. Kelly. Yes, that's good.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you.
A little closer.
We're
a little closer.
Oh, closer?
Yeah, there you go.
All right. I'm from North Dakota. I want to begin with the important stuff, which is inviting you all to the hockey game tomorrow night. Liberty's ranked #3 in the country. My school's ranked #2 in the country. They played before. It's good hockey. They're not best friends. And Dr. Habermas and I are going to be at the game, and hope to see a lot of you there. Should be good stuff. Postmodernism is
it's a broad question. Yeah, that's a complicated question.
For our purposes, we're both philosophers. We're both Christian philosophers. We think it makes sense to believe that Christianity is true. We don't throw our brains out the window, and we think there are good reasons to be a Christian, and there are good reasons to reject alternative worldviews. One of the things about postmodernism is they are skeptical about our ability to know the world. They have doubts about whether we can know whether there's such a thing as truth, and whether a worldview such as Christianity is true. And what I try to do in my work is to show, to put it simply, that postmodernism gets some important things wrong, though they also get some things right. And as Christians, we can interact, dialogue with postmodernism, and still affirm that the traditional Christian faith is the most reasonable way to go.
Great, thank you. And it's been classified in several different ways, and I think the definition of it is necessarily ambiguous. Is that correct? Some people have defined it as an era, the era that succeeds modernism. Some people have defined it as a mood, just among culture, maybe an apathetic mood or a skeptical mood. What would you say captures the definition the best?
They have doubts about truth in general, and Christianity as a particular example of a true worldview. And they have doubts about our ability to see the world the way it really is, to know it and understand it. Way back in the 1960s, when I was young and Dr. Habermas was older, there was a television show called Hogan's Heroes. And one of the regulars on the show was Sergeant Schultz, and his famous line was, "I know nothing." And as a philosopher, if you think about it, even as a kid, I would say to my father, doesn't he at least know that the only thing he knows is that he doesn't know anything else? And if it were literally true that he didn't know anything, he couldn't even say that he knew nothing. So when you talk about knowledge and truth, goal number one is not to contradict yourself. So if somebody says there's no such thing as truth, the question immediately comes up, what about that claim? Is it true that there's no such thing as truth? And you're off and running. So in our work, we try to show that knowledge is possible. Dr. Habermas does a lot of work on the resurrection and 1990 years ago, and well, when Jesus existed, and no, you came a generation later than that. But we can study the past, and we can honestly know that there are good reasons to affirm that the resurrection really took place, and it's not just our opinion. There are good reasons in support of what we're doing.
So with there being several aspects of postmodernism, such as skepticism and deconstruction, and even like elements of anti-capitalism and strange confluence of ideas, can it be redeemed for use by Christians? There have been a couple Christian scholars who have attempted this, such as James K.A. Smith or Kevin Van Hooser, who tried to focus on the virtuous aspects of postmodernism while allaying the vicious aspects? What would you say about those types of attempts to?
I'd say that's a really good question. Kevin Van Hooser teaches at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where I was a student 40 years ago. And he's committed to the inerrancy of Scripture and the Lordship of Jesus. James Smith is also a very good scholar. He's not, my understanding is he's not fully committed to the inerrancy of Scripture. And there's some good things in his work, but I would disagree with him on a couple of matters, such as the idea that the Scriptures are fully without error. So.
Okay. Dr. H, you want to jump in on that, or
step in on what?
Would you say it'd be possible to reclaim some aspects of postmodernism for Christian use, or do you think it's just as a whole is an issue?
You know, when I'm doing apologetics on the resurrection on university campuses or in my publications, I respond to groups when I think they're giving specific objections to an event like the resurrection. In fact, I've got this great big work I'm doing on the resurrection, and volume 2 is on those responses. And right now it's 1,100 pages, just responses. So I'm just saying, there's a lot you can say. I usually don't go out of my way to pick fights with them. I want them to tell me what's wrong with what I'm saying, because if somebody lets the resurrection of Christ go, which is what we call the gospel message, to which people who say, I do to Jesus because of that message, I mean, that's Christianity. I don't really care what they think about it, unless they, I mean, I hope, I'd like them to agree, but if they want to come to me, I'd talk about it, but I don't go out of my way to track people down. I do think the apologetic I use, the method I use, would include postmodernists. My response. I don't know if you want me to talk about, no, in fact, sooner or later you've got a question.
We'll do it a little bit.
So yeah, I'll wait for you.
Okay, well, a big aspect of postmodernism, like we said, is the skepticism, and which implies a view of the nature of truth. There are various, views of theories of truth. Is the Christian, since it seems to be that Christianity at least generally is against postmodernism, or there's some conflict there, would you say that there is a view of truth that Christians are committed to? There's coherence theory of truth, pragmatic, correspondence, primitive, things like that. Would you say that, first of all, I mean, we need to define some of those terms first, but would you say that a Christian is committed to anything based on the biblical data?
The most common traditional view of truth is called the correspondence theory, or the correspondence view of truth. It's a pretty simple idea. It's when you or I say something, we then, speaking figuratively, look at reality and see if it matches up. So if you're at home and your brother or sister or mother comes running out and says there's a gorilla at the front door, all right, and you say no, there's not. They say yes, there is. You go to the front door and you open it, and you see if there's a gorilla there. And the basic idea is, if there is, then it's true, and if it's not, then it's not. And I mean, there is such a thing as truth. I mean, there were. When I was a young boy, I was alive when President Kennedy, was assassinated, and there were people who claimed that he wasn't killed and he was hanging out with Marilyn Monroe and James Dean and Elvis, and they're about to do a big comeback tour. I mean, don't run out and look at it. I mean, there's a video, the Zapruder film of the assassination. And whatever else is true or who killed him, he ended up dead. So we're limited by what we can say, because whether or not it matches up with reality. So, I could say I'm the best quarterback in the history of the NFL, but the evidence isn't exactly on my side. So,
Are you a center for the NBA though?
yeah. A lot of people I look up to.
Well, given that, this kind of leapfrogs off of that. Do theories of truth, such as the correspondence theory of truth, and this might sound simplistic, but as we flesh it out, maybe we can see how this relates. Do theories of truth have implications for truth claims central to Christianity?
Yeah, there was a debate a number of years ago between a very good Christian philosopher named William Lane Craig and a New Testament scholar named Marcus Borg. And Borg claimed that he believed that Jesus was risen from the dead, but what he meant was, as he put it, Jesus was risen in our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
All right, sort of like acid reflux or heartburn or something like that. And William Lane Craig rightly said, if we had had a video camera back then, it would have shown that the tomb was actually empty. It's not just that they believed that he was risen from the dead. There were people who saw him, and the tomb was empty. And as Dr. Habermas describes in a lot of his works, you have a tough time explaining why all these ordinary, everyday people, the disciples, are going to go out and risk their lives if they know the body's still in the tomb. And it would be a joke, but they go and risk it because they know he is actually risen.
The next question, I think we'll elaborate on this a little bit more. So the next question is, what is the minimal facts approach to investigating historical truth claims? And this is relevant because this is kind of where the two might intersect, right? Because the question we have to ask ourselves is, okay, if there was a video camera there, it would have shown Jesus, the empty tomb. Okay, so how can we see that given the limited data that we have? What are the access points to understanding what really happened back then?
Yeah, the minimal facts argument, years ago, I interchanged the terms core facts and minimal facts. I think minimal facts is more obvious what the definition is, but I still to this day remember I was a pastor and I'd just been accepted to do a PhD at Michigan State. And I was sitting in my living room and I was going through a bunch of doubts, even though I was a pastor, and I didn't share them with the people in the church, and I had a lot of questions. In fact, I went through years and years of doubts. That was nothing new. I was sitting there and I thought, how can I answer this theory? And it was a form of the legend theory that Christians borrowed the message from somebody else and never saw Jesus and so on, but there's a dozen varieties of it. And I was sitting there doing it, and I got this sheet of paper and I wrote down, well, if I only made a list of what critics would allow, what they think we can establish. It's funny, even if they call themselves postmodernists, they'll give lists of facts, at least the ones I deal with. And they'll say this, and this is legit. And so I thought, well, if not all of Scripture, if I just use what they give me, how would I answer this objection? And I said, well, if I take their facts, I have this, and this response, and I came up with about, I don't know, a dozen responses. Then I made a note on that sheet, and I said, if an even more skeptical skeptic said, I'm going to give you less facts, could I still do it? And I took what I considered the lowest common denominator of facts that they would allow, and I made a list of refutations of this theory based on their facts. So it's a heads I win, tails you lose argument. So if their facts are all we know, if the real skeptical ones, the most skeptical ones, see, what a lot of you maybe don't know, especially even you folks in divinity, is that there's a goodly number of Bible scholars out there who are atheists. They have PhDs, and they are in relevant fields, and they're atheists, they're agnostics, they're skeptics. They are, by their own definition, non-Christians. They're Jewish New Testament scholars. They're, almost any ilk of belief you can imagine. And so I started using their lists, and I honed this thing down over the years, and I knew I was going to Michigan State. So I took that list with me. And Ben, where are you seated? My teaching assistant. Ben, over here. Oh, by the way, he was a hockey player. He was captain for a while on our hockey team years ago.
How many teeth do you got, Ben? How many teeth do you still get?
Anyway, he called me not long ago and he said, "You still have that sheet of paper?" And I dug it out of my file, and I was really surprised because I found the sheet with the date on it that I was sitting in my living room making this lesser and lesser and lesser lowest common denominator list of facts. So I took it with me to Michigan State. And basically, here's the argument in a nutshell. I had to satisfy, I had a historian on my committee, I had 2 philosophers, and several biblical people. We didn't have the 2 or 3 neat committees that you all have here. I had 6 people on my committee, and 1 was added at the last moment. That's a long story about that. But I had 3 who thought the resurrection probably happened, and 3 who were adamantly opposed. And so that was my committee. And they had to read my dissertation. So I developed this idea that I would use the lowest common denominator and argue that the resurrection occurred. And so I kind of developed it in this dissertation. And oh, by the way, the head of my committee, I had 2 heads because the heads do different things. The program director and the specific head of my dissertation. And as we were walking out of the meeting where we were honing my dissertation topic, the head of the program, who didn't believe it, said to me, he said, "Oh, by the way, we don't care if you do a resurrection." He said, "We're liberal here, but we're liberal in the good sense that if you can establish it, you can run with it, even if we don't agree with you. You'll pass." And I thought, that's a definition of fair liberalism. If you can make your case, they'll recognize it, even if they don't like it. And then he started to turn away and he goes, "Oh yeah, don't tell us the resurrection happened because the Bible said so." And I went, well, I didn't want them to know that I had, you never let your opponent in a hockey game or anything. You never want them to know that they see a little bit of weakness. So I said, "Oh, yeah, okay, I'll work on that." And I thought, what am I going to have, 10 pages? So, but he did not mean, and a lot of uninitiated people think they know what these guys mean. You can't use the New Testament because it's a circular argument. It's a Christian book and ... He did not mean that. Atheist or agnostic New Testament scholars will allow you to use a lot of the New Testament. In fact, Bart Ehrman, the best known skeptic probably in the world, atheist New Testament scholar, if you don't use verses, he will. He uses more verses than the average Christian does. But he's, it's like the spider on a spider web. A spider knows what strands to walk on so it doesn't get caught. The skeptic knows what verses to pick out because the person knows it'll stand the test of scholarship. So they will admit the verses, mostly Paul's writings. And so I said, okay. And then as he was walking away again, I said, "How long does this thing have to be?" He said, 200 pages at least. I said, "Can you believe this? His first meeting." I said, "Will you take any less?" He said, 180. We can't budge on that. The thing turned out to be 350 pages. So what I developed was this idea of, can we establish what the lowest common denominator of facts, with each fact being established by a long list of other facts. And these facts are the result, with each one having many. And you'd be surprised how many there are. Some of the facts in the short list, without exaggerating, they have up to 35 considerations in their favor of one fact. Backup points. That's why the critics don't argue. And so my dissertation was, let's see if we can take these facts and make the resurrection work. I argued it would work. And I can't believe that to this day, but they did not make me take a single line out of my dissertation. They didn't make me add a single line to my dissertation. They took it as is. And the most complimentary person on my committee was the Jewish historian who represented the history department. So I didn't know what I was doing. I was just, and all of this developed from that.
Could you talk a little bit more about, because there's 2 aspects to the minimal facts method.
Yes.
And you touched on the popularity aspect, which is the lowest common denominator among scholars. 90% of scholars agree with this, but in your writings you say this is a lesser aspect of the minimal facts. The more important aspect is the using things such as authenticity criteria to determine whether something really happened. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I use two steps to get a minimal fact. The first one is by far the most important one, and it is, can the facts I use be established by the available data? And you can't just say, well, here's this verse, if nobody accepts the verse. So I will use no facts which are not multiply evidenced by known data. That's by far the most important. The second one, and you said 90%, David. I was just asked recently a kind of a challenge thing like this, but the person said, why do you require 90%? I don't require 90%. It's just that when you start doing a head count, there's well over 90% who will admit these facts. It's not a requirement of mine, that's just where everybody lined up. And in all my debates and dialogues, virtually nobody tells me that fact or that fact is not accepted. It's always accepted, even the most skeptical, postmodern, whatever literature, it's conceded. The fact's conceded. So the second one is everyone agrees with that. But here's the point I make. If tomorrow nobody agrees with these facts anymore, that doesn't mean I lose the minimal facts argument. I still have the evidences. And just because they don't like what I'm using, they have to tell me what's wrong with what I'm using.
Right.
But right now, everybody uses the data. And I'm probably going to get this question. I'll prime the pump. Somebody can ask this if they want to. But it's probably the most common question I get. It's not, is this fact right or wrong? People don't pick at those. They'll say, well, if all the skeptics admit these facts, how come they don't become Christians? And for you philosophers, everybody in here who's a philosophy major or minor should be able to answer that question, irrespective of the resurrection. But most of us, according to data, short answer, most of us do not choose because of data. We choose because of previous worldviews and likes and dislikes. No matter what the data are, you don't say, well, golly, you sure got me on that one. No, the first question is, can I take that with my worldview? And if I can't, I'm going to say it's false, even if I can't give you a reason. That's what the scholars should deal with. That's popular people who respond to what you're doing. The scholars allow the data. Does that help?
Yep. After that, so using this method, what minimal facts emerge from this method when investigating the resurrection?
Okay, I started with the verses, a list of 12 in my dissertation, and then I shrunk it to a list of 6. And I did that because the 12 are acknowledged by a really high percent, maybe even over 90. One isn't. Minimal fact, the empty tomb is going to be acknowledged today. When I was in graduate school, almost nobody believed in the empty tomb. A guy named Rudolf Bultmann was the head of the theological ship in America, and he denied the empty tomb, and so did all his followers, and he was the most influential person at that time. And so the empty tomb was generally rejected. But if you stood up in class and said, I believe in the empty tomb, they would know right away you're either A, an evangelical, or B, a conservative Catholic. And that was, probably pretty true. Now, because of the data and things have changed, the empty tomb has, should I be sad that the empty tomb is only supported by about 75% of scholars instead of 90? Therefore, it's not one of my mental facts. Or should I be happy that it used to be supported by about 40% when I was in grad school, and now it's 75? So there's two sides to that. I started with a list of 12. Empty tomb is in the larger list of 12. But then when I started honing it, tightening the screw, so to speak, to get an even tighter list, I ended up with 6. The empty tomb is just outside of that. The other 6 are still pretty good, but I usually go with 6. You want me to give them real fast?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, the 6 I would use today, I would start with Jesus died by crucifixion, and there's a lot of data for this. In fact, if you're interested, I and Ben, my TA, and a medical, well, he's finishing his MD, and he's got a PhD from Texas Tech School of Medicine. And we published an article in a medical journal on how Jesus died by crucifixion. And they had to send it out to peer review of physicians, and the article was accepted. So all I'm saying is there's a lot of data for why and how Jesus died. Secondly, afterwards, the disciples had experiences that they believe were appearances of the risen Jesus. And I'm telling you, there's almost nobody who's going to deny that. Now, listen, when I say nobody, I don't mean, I don't want to be pejorative, but I don't mean somebody who claims to be a scholar. They're 20 years old, they haven't gone to college yet, they still live with their folks, but they say they're a scholar. They really do. They will write things, they say there's a scholar, and they say everybody else is wrong because they let us use the New Testament. So these so-called atheist New Testament professors are just stupid because they would never allow that. And I'm saying, why do I care what you allow and what you don't allow? Why are you the standard for anything? You don't get out of your bedroom.
Well, you're not being pejorative, though.
I'm not being pejorative one bit. That was a joke. Okay, that was all a joke. But it is a very important point. I'm only citing people who have terminal degrees in a relevant area. New Testament theology, history, philosophy, classics, archaeology, fields like that. They have to know what they're talking about. They can disagree. In fact, I will rather read and cite atheist New Testament scholars than I would to cite evangelicals, because I want to show that if those guys accept it, y'all got some explaining to do. Okay, so they admit that fact. Second one, disciples thought they saw the risen Jesus. Third, they proclaimed it immediately. They started claiming this. When you do history, two important rules for history are early and eyewitness material. I once heard of a former soldier doing his memoirs of World War II, and he was writing about his experience of World War II in 1990. Now, he was an eyewitness, but neither his writing nor his memories nor his writing were early and eyewitness. They were eyewitness. 40 years later is a little bit tough. So it's important to say early and eyewitness. Early, we have eyewitness too. Thirdly, those who were convinced were willing, they preached the gospel and were willing to die. You cannot prove that all 12 disciples died as martyrs for their faith. That's so often said about Christians. Now, see, that's something we can learn from postmodernism from critics. They are right that we only have early documents for a few of them. By the way, the biggest four, Paul, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John, the four most influential Christians in history, we have first century documents for the martyrdom of 3 of the 4, and a second century document for the martyrdom of the 4th one. So that's how you build data. They were willing to die. And then 2 skeptics who were not believers, as far as we know. James, the brother of Jesus, who Mark 3 says Jesus' brothers thought he was mentally ill. The Greek actually says that. The Greek said they thought he was beside himself, like he was schizophrenic or something. And John specifically says in John 7, his brothers did not believe in him. And Paul, who couldn't stand the early Christian message, and later the Lord had something to say to him on the way to Damascus. So there are 2 that meet the this criterion. And so James and Paul are my last 2. They're 5 and 6.
Okay, great. I want to jump into a little bit of how Dr. Kelly, because when we're talking about modernism and postmodernism, we use labels like liberalism, and which seems to be, like we associate that as a political term, but when we're talking about it within like scholarship within history, how would you say modernist approaches actually are a little bit more beneficial to investigating questions of like the resurrection, truth claims like that?
If I can say one thing, my use of the word liberal, there is a movement from 1799 to 1918, and the movement was literally called the German liberals, or the old German liberals. It's a movement. So I'm using it formally with the capital L, not just anybody who doesn't agree with me.
So you're saying you're a liberal, is it? I'm just kidding.
Liberal somehow.
Liberals had their issues, but they also had a confidence in human reason that we could we can study religions and study Christianity and come to understand it and to know it. And most philosophers, Dr. Habermas and I are typical, have a degree of trust in human reason that we can understand the world and go from there.
Would you say that it's postmodernism, view, skepticism, and deconstruction? Would you say that those are pervasive beliefs, or just selected to like aesthetic judgments and moral judgments? Do you think that people who have a postmodern mood, people who are influenced by the culture, view just the nature of truth that way, or do you think it's more to these axiological questions?
There's a lot there in modern sociology. The people who teach, I teach at a state university. The people who teach sociology there say truth is intersubjective consensus. What's that mean? That means that the group of scholars who are sociologists agree on something. And it doesn't say at all whether they're right or whether their claims are true. And part of what they're trying to get at is many modern Christians are viewed as intolerant. And the idea is, if you claim Christianity is true, that implies that other worldviews like Hinduism and Buddhism are false, and that's unkind, if not intolerant. Part of what we do as scholars is to indicate the main claim that Christianity is true comes from Jesus himself. It's not us making the claim. It's us seeing what Jesus himself said, and then as Dr. Habermas shows in his research on the resurrection, Jesus backs up his claims. And the gospel is offered to everybody, but it's also clear that those who reject them, that there are consequences for doing that.
Would you say that there, maybe I should reframe this, how would you communicate the truth of the resurrection to a postmodernist who doesn't have this same view of truth as a modernist would?
I'd probably start by getting them to agree that certain common everyday claims are true. So right now there are hundreds of human beings in the room, and there are lights on, and there's a camera on, which I'm trying to avoid, and all these things are clearly true. And if you can get people to agree that certain common everyday claims are true, it at least opens the door that more important things about worldviews and religion and Christianity may at least need to be investigated to see whether they are also true.
So maybe pointing to existential things about their lives that seem significant and also obviously true. Like, you're not a postmodernist when you go to your medicine cabinet and there's rat poison there and you're selecting between.
Right, and people who claim they don't trust their senses, when they hit a low doorway, they duck every time. So, I mean, there are limits as to, you can't be skeptical about everything and function in the everyday world.
Dr. H, what would you give?
One question really fast. This is just like a one-line thing. So what you just said, if I heard you correctly, is how you would go after postmodernists is a sort of minimal facts argument using agreed upon truth.
Correct.
So the move is similar, but the data are different.
Right.
Epiphany. All right. So we're gonna start to open it up to the audience pretty soon. We're gonna have you guys stand at the aisles here, both of the aisles, and my friend Sam here will hand you the mic to ask the questions. But as you guys can get up and start to line up. As you're doing that, do either of you have closing statements that may tie elements of the dialogue together? I mean, the bridging the gap through minimal facts, I think, was a great one. But any other closing ideas?
Liberty 8, why not state 2? Oh, there's also a Saturday game. They've come back a little bit, 7-4.
Sam, okay. Can you bring it up?
Hello. Hello? Is it working? Okay, I will ask it really loudly. Is this for recording purposes?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm curious then, specifically on postmodernism's view of like, you can't reach any form of the meta-narrative. How are we supposed to say something like, well, you should believe the resurrection? Like, I can personally believe it, and I can think, well, I think this is true in my own experience or in my own study, but how could I move to saying you should believe this is true and that it's universally true to somebody who doesn't believe in some kind of overarching truth or overarching meta-narrative?
Should be the meta-narrative thing. How would the other parts go?
Meta-narratives are big stories or worldviews. Christianity is one of a number of examples. It's a common claim that we can't know any meta-narratives or big stories to be true, but that itself is a meta-narrative. They claim that we can't know anything to be true, but then yet they claim that it's true that there aren't any meta-narratives. So there's no way not to have a worldview. Everybody has one, whether they have it well developed or worked out at not. I mean, it'd be like somebody once said, even the claim there's no such thing as truth assumes that there's one truth, namely that there isn't any. So there's no way to avoid meta-narratives, and Christianity is one of the contenders, and we're arguing it's easily the best and most defensible. Not only are there good reasons to be a Christian, alternatives like Buddhism or secular humanism are pretty unimpressive. And I mean, even the German philosopher Leibniz wondered why is there something rather than nothing? The universe exists. It's not eternal, hasn't been here forever, so it came into existence. And Christians have a story, a true story, that it came into existence because an eternal and perfect being brought it into existence many, many years ago. And there's no way around meta-narratives, and the issue then is to move on. What's the best story, or what's the most truthful?
Yeah, and I just add, I would just add that it's not true because we say it's true. It's true because we have good data. If anybody wants to dispute that, they can dispute it, and I think we'll see very quickly what happens. Now, I'll just tell you real quickly, in my area, in history in particular, with regard to Christian claims, take all any major religion you want, and I'll give you a rundown if you're interested, but critics like to say that the Gospel of John is too late to report anything truly, and John is only writing 60 years after the death of Jesus. Whereas if you can take any major religion and let their people do the speaking, and I'm not us telling you what they believe, them telling you what they believe. I've got a Buddhist source on my shelf that says the earliest sources for Buddha's life are 600, 800 years after he died. Compare that to the horribly late 65 years for John. And by the way, we have sources. I just did an interview today live with one of the better known apologists on YouTube, and I gave 5 different kinds of empirical evidence that all were in existence within 6 years of the crucifixion. And we don't talk like that. We go to the Gospels and things like that. Gospels are fine, but we can beat it. So 600, 800 years for Buddha, and then the guy went on to say, We do not even know what Buddha taught. The guy's a PhD Buddhist. The earliest sources for Zoroaster, theological sources, 1,000 years later. Earliest years for the Upanishads of Hinduism, 1,800 years. Earliest years for the Bhagavad Gita, 4,200 years later. There's just no comparison. So somebody could say, well, I think you're being very pejorative saying non-Christians are wrong. I'm saying, I didn't say that. Stewart said it earlier, that's what Jesus claimed. I'm telling you that his claims stack up, but I didn't make some kind of rule that says I'm right and you're wrong because you're not good looking and I am. I mean, we're not using those kind of responses. If they want to here's what happens, because I've done this all my life. Once you start repeating the facts, they'll go like this. Well, you don't have to be nasty about it. Well, I wasn't the one being nasty. I just said I had better data. If you don't like that, find better data. That's how you refute it. But here, I don't believe in data. Then you're right back to what Stewart said. Everybody believes data. You wouldn't be driving your car home today if you didn't believe there were data that you could know. So you have to work through the steps, but the conversation goes downhill quickly, and often the other side says, well, I don't like that. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not an argument.
Leapfrogging off of that a little bit, because postmodernists seem to be focused more on, even though they don't agree to a meta-narrative, they like to focus on individual narratives because we like anecdotes. Anecdotes are moving to us rhetorically. We remember those things better than just data sets. Is there you've done work on doubt, and I think this ties into that, into how people's attitudes relate. Maybe there's a connection there for postmodern people and maybe
on the
doubt.
On the doubt side of things?
Yeah, on the doubt side of things.
Yeah. I had to get into some doubt questions years ago, not only because I went through it a lot, but because when people found out I was doing this, they started saying, well, help me with this. And I feel like I'm going off the deep end, and I'm a Christian, but I feel like I'm rejected. And if you don't talk to me, they'll say in an email. A lady just said to me recently, I'm barely hanging on by my fingernails. If you don't talk to me the next 3 days, I think I'm going to fall off the cliff. She literally said that. I'm not going to believe anymore. All right, so I work with one of the top psychologists here at the university, Gary Simpson, who the longest time was, he was director of the PhD program in counseling. And Gary gave a battery of tests a week, and he was checking some theory out with a bunch of students and non-students. And the majority of doubters, everybody doubts for some reason. All you can do is ask questions, and now congratulations, you're a doubter, because you're asking questions. By far, the largest majority of doubters doubt for emotional reasons, not for factual reasons. But you men, this is how it lines up on the questionnaire. Men will more likely than women, men will say, I reject that. I don't think emotionally. Well, you're talking emotionally. Well, I believe we should talk about facts. Well, I've already told you some facts. Why don't you tell me what the contrary facts are? I don't like this conversation. Well, I'm sorry, that's not an argument. And it melts down really fast. But I tell my wife hears me lecture on this all the time, and she says, women have an advantage over men. We know we're emotional. And I mean, it's true, but there's fallout with that too. But so I do think the majority of doubts are emotional. They're not based on facts, but guys in particular do not want to admit that the doubts are emotional. They'll say, they'll say, not me, mine's about the facts. They want to refute what I'm talking about. I don't know, let me go study this. Well, please do and come back. Well, I'm just telling you, in the meantime, I don't like it. Well, fine, that sounds emotional to me. By the way, here's two of the ways you can tell your doubts are emotional. If you ask what if questions, and when you think you have data, they make you feel better for a couple hours, but 2 days from now, you're right back where you were right now. But here's the more important reason, especially for Christians. If you are doubting and the doubt hurts, does it hurt to doubt? Well, yeah, because if this isn't true, I might be going to hell, and I really don't want to be thinking like that. So yeah, I have some distressful nights lately. Okay, that's okay. We're human beings, and we do that kind of stuff. I want you to know that's an emotional reason. That's not a factual reason. So, and that's the answer to the earlier question, by the way. If the facts you use are all true, why don't all atheists fall on their knees and trust Christ? Because they don't like the meta-narrative. They don't like it, which is emotional. It's not factual because they haven't done anything to refute the facts.
Sam, could you go over here? That'll.
Hello. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I have a very short and simple question, but I believe it's one that Christians don't often ask, that should be asked. Since the body of Jesus is resurrected, where is the body now?
How about a 2-word answer? With God.
Yeah.
If he left the world either by virtue of the ascension or just decided not to appear anymore, he said he was going to be with God. In the earliest creeds we have, creedal statements in the New Testament, that date starting 1 to 2 years after the cross. They're very, very early, and even atheist New Testament scholars put them that early. They say things all the time, like he's seated on the right hand of God. He's gone back to his Father. Every knee will bow, every tongue will confess, over and over. So the simple answer is he's not here because he left. I mean, he's free to do that.
Go ahead.
Go now. Okay. So is that like a physical location or like another dimension, or like is there a way we can know that?
Well, I'll tell you what. After the resurrection, the topic I've done the most studying on and publishing on is near-death experiences. It's an analogous state because a person who says they're up above their body, and there's so much, you're going to hear more about this, but polls and everything are changing right now. They're changing the view of afterlife very profoundly because there are over 300 evidential cases while people in a near-death state see something 5 miles away that can be verified. But at the time, they were on the bed with no measurable brain or heart activity. They shouldn't be able to do this. Okay, but they're in an alternate world. You go, well, they say they are. No, what happens is, in the real simple ones without all the heavy data, they're up above their body and they're looking down there and they'll go, quit beating on my chest. I don't want to come back. Just let me go, all right? Just let me go. The doctor never, I saw a cartoon one time where the doctor looks up to the NDE or floating over the bed and says, are you going to come back down here or do I pronounce you dead? But what I mean is nobody ever responds to the NDE. They're in some kind of alternate reality. Now, I can't tell you what it is. I can't define it. I'm not an expert on how many dimensions there are. I'm not, you know what? All I know is that there's empirical evidence that there's something else going on here. And I think, given that we know the truth of the resurrection and bringing in NDEs because it helped. By the way, I use NDEs with the resurrection like this. People go, well, you want me to believe an alternate view of reality. I believe only in this world, and I'm a scientist, so I only believe what's going on in this world. I say, what do you do with NDEs? And I asked that of one of the, all of you who know the field would know the guy I'm going to mention. I said it in a debate to one of the best known skeptics in the world. And you know what he said to me? Quote, I don't want to discuss NDEs. He's going to start, the data are as good as intelligent design and all that kind of stuff. They're really good data. All I'm saying is NDEs are good for a cognate argument that there's another dimension of some sort, I don't know what you call it, and more importantly, there's some kind of afterlife, even if it only lasts for a few hours. So therefore, you can't call me an idiot for talking about the resurrection, especially when all the data are on my side.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ooh, sweet.
So I think you, oh, there he goes. So I think you kind of touched on this with the previous guy that was right here's question, but obviously a big thing with belief and disbelief, and you use this term as where someone's worldview comes from, and you can have all the facts in the world and present all the facts in the world, and sometimes that worldview is the biggest obstacle. What do we do in that circumstance when we start getting into the realm of worldviews, and whether or not your worldview's right and mine's right? Is that where we kind of like back off a little bit and say this is something they're going to have to work out themselves, or is there some way we can kind of walk through that?
Part of it is trying to figure out where their heart is. I have a younger brother who 40 years ago had a vision And in the vision, Jesus appeared to him and said to him, I died on the cross for your sins. And I said, what are you looking for? And I pursued it, and I said, if I answer all your questions decently, will you believe? And he was honest enough to say, probably not. He had a heart issue. He didn't want to give control of his life to anyone, let alone Jesus. And the head issues are relevant, but the heart issues are also relevant. And it gets complicated as to why some people are more open than others, and whether it's the work of the Spirit or whatever the case might be. But some people have genuine head objections, but some of them also have heart issues, and we pray for them, and we walk, and we be a friend and try to walk through it with them, and pray for the best.
That was really similar to what I was going to ask, but I'll ask, what is it about the resurrection for you, both of you, that has personally been so enthralling, like so intriguing that you're willing to spend so much time, like, looking into it?
I would have given a different answer up until 1995, because I went through a lot of doubts for a long time. A lot of real serious doubts. I used to debate Christians. I used to tell them they were crazy. So, been there, done that. So, the resurrection meant one thing when it was all back there and it was a nice tight world and you had facts or you don't have facts. In 1995, my wife died of stomach cancer. And I'm making a long story short. She's the mother of my 4 children, my best friend in the world. She was very small, stature-wise. We watched her lose half her body weight. And she was buried. My 2 oldest kids came into the room in the next week or 2 and said, my best friend has died. I never thought they thought that about us as parents, but they said that. It was a major event in my life. And all of a sudden, this father of 4 who taught at Liberty University, I didn't realize that it all caved in at one time, and my kids need clothes to wear in the morning. They better be clean. They need a lunch. They need a dinner. Who's going to help with their homework? Get them on the bus the next day. Oh, and by the way, I have classes to teach. So things became very complicated very fast. But I realized that if Christianity's true, and I truly believe the most important data are on our side, I don't believe any religion competes in terms of data. They can have a heart response and go, well, I just don't believe that. Oh, okay, that's fine. But I think the data is on our side. It made a lot more sense to me after my wife died to say, I'm glad she's where nobody can touch her. She can't be sick anymore. She can't be hurt. I'm sick as anything from losing her, but there's some good things that come in the sense that she can't move from there. She's fine. So the resurrection started. I'd written on that aspect before, not when someone died, but I did resurrection and grief studies before. I was able to see personally that if the resurrection is true, she's got a home, and we'll all be together someday. Anyone who knows Christ. So, what I'm saying is, I added the existential element to the factual element. I wouldn't. As a person, I would never have done that if I didn't have a factual basis. I don't care how much my heart would want to see her. I could just say I hope so and quit thinking about it if there's no data, because I wouldn't have anything very comforting. But when the facts met the existential portion, it gave me. Let's put this. I'll end with this. Paul makes the comment: when people die, he said, "We grieve, but we are not people without hope." So think about it. Grieving is not necessarily, there's psychologists tell us there's some good things that come from it, but by and large, good grief is better than bad grief, and grounded grief is better than ungrounded grief. And having a place that eternity, where there's near-death experiences and the resurrection, I think a lot of things play together, nature of God, I think a lot of things play together to say we'll all be with her one day, and that, I think, is what Paul's saying. There's a great ground for hope when facts ground your beliefs.
Often within the realm of apologetics and like dialogue within apologetics, it's easy to give analogies. So like unbelievers or agnostics or atheists can relate to kind of what we're trying to prove to them. So within the topic of the resurrection, though, I have not ever heard like a number one analogy kind of to relate to someone who is asking a question about it. So like what is your go-to analogy when discussing the resurrection with an unbeliever, an atheist, agnostic?
Analogy, number one analogy for what aspect of the resurrection, or what aspect of life, or whatever.
Jesus was resurrected. Jesus' body resurrected.
What's an analogy I would use? Is that an analogy? I thought you're. I'm not sure what you're getting. I'm sure I do it because I lecture a lot and I come up with all kinds of crazy stories like that spider running across the web that I used earlier. I use all kinds of analogies, but I'm drawing a blanket to what you're asking.
Could you rephrase it? Just, yeah. No, go ahead and rephrase it. Okay, well, we'll skip. Get the skip button.
This isn't like a really profound or philosophical question. It's more practical and pragmatic. Upon discovering that this is real and like defending the resurrection so well, I think something that prohibits and prevents a lot of believers or Christians from sharing their faith, from evangelizing, from like going to Target and actually ministering to an employee nearby is this fear, trepidation deriving from like, we don't know enough, or they might ask a question I don't know. And now we have like the invaluable opportunity of being in a room with you guys. And so how did your study or your knowledge of like the resurrection is real inform your day-to-day? Like, I'm going to go to La Coretta and pray for our server and like minister to them. Like, how did it transform you, and does it like transform you to go share Jesus everywhere?
I'll say something too.
I teach at a secular state university. They pretty much, within reason, they let me do what I want as long as I'm respectful and fair. So when I talk about the existence of God, I give the strongest argument I know of in favor of belief in God, and then I give the strongest argument against belief in God, and I pray that they have the wisdom to see that the argument for God is a lot stronger than the argument against. And if you treat students with kindness and respect, it opens a lot of doors, and they come and talk to me, and I pray for opportunities, and you abide in the Holy Spirit, and because you're not doing it in your own strength, yeah, I mean, they're good questions. They're difficult questions, but at some level, you know that Jesus was who he claimed he was, and I'm by nature an introvert. It's taken me 40 years to get comfortable, talking to other people and being bold and so forth. And you look and pray for opportunities, and you follow the Spirit, and you go from there.
I have an easier job. I teach at Liberty. And I only teach PhD students right now. So, I mean, it's a real blessing to see that these people probably average 40 years of age, and probably the average number of master's degrees is 2 or 3 apiece, and a couple of them have another doctorate, and they're really sharp people. But that doesn't mean, I'll tell you what, you never get so many degrees or so smart that you are not open to emotional doubt. It's a crippler. And so I would say, for my part, it's not just knowing why you believe what you believe. I like C.S. Lewis's line. He talks about emotional doubt. And you could tell from reading C.S. Lewis, he's a veteran emotional doubter. And he says in Mere Christianity, you have to learn to tell your emotions where to get off. And I love that phrase because sometimes we preach to other people, but we don't preach to ourselves. And we have to tell ourselves to quit thinking stupid things that are not grounded, and don't build your life on what if things that are ungrounded, and things like that. And when things are true and they're not always good news, I would say what I thought you were starting to ask right there at the end. Well, you did in a way. How did we get there? Me, it was my doubts, and my doubts made me read one more book. And this guy goes, wow, he's got a good bib in the back. So I look up the bib, I go for sources. I don't want that one. Oh, wow, that one looks like he's talking to me. I get the book, so my library gets very big, very fast, and I get very poor. And so I do it by personal study. Remember, I started real early with discussions, but sitting there in my living room thinking about how I would answer this objection. And then what happens if the objection gets tougher and tougher and tougher? That was way beyond what any person would ever ask me, what skeptic. But by working through it yourself and be honest with yourself, and I'd also say build up your emotional barricade as well as your intellectual barricade, because we need both kinds of weapons. And most people who go down, wherever go down is, I'm not talking about internal security or whatever, I'm just talking about they walk away in whatever sense. Most people, according to the stats, who walk away for emotional reasons, and it gets the best of them. So if all your armory is in the front and someone comes from the back, and you're not able to deal with it, that's a problem. So I'd say get the emotions steeled up there too.
We have about time for one more question, so I'll pass it to him, and then we'll still be here for a little bit. So if you guys still want to talk to our speakers,
okay, so hopefully this is somewhat coherent. I'm a little bit of a lay person in this topic, but this kind of touches at the sense of truth a little bit, and it's pretty easy to understand like that truth is foundational, right? Because if you would claim, as you said, you would claim that there's no truth, that in and of itself is a truth. So is it troublesome for the concept of Ratio ex nihilo, as well as perhaps divine aseity, to posit that truth is eternal, like an eternal object or an abstract object in the sense of Platonism? Or can we kind of coincide that with absolute creationism? It's kind of I don't know if that's coherent, but.
Most mathematicians, statements that are true, or what philosophers like to call propositions, there are good reasons to think that they're eternally true. So the fact that there are a bunch of human beings in this room right now, that is now true for all eternity. Now whether or not, two of the good philosophers at Biola, William Lane Craig and Scott Smith, have a running dialogue on whether Plato's right or the non-Plato people are right. So I would suggest reading them, and there is truth. All the details can get Christians can disagree on some of them, and investigate it for yourself and see if you see which one side makes more sense than the other.
Plato's right.
All right, guys. Well, thank you for your time. That concludes our dialogue and discussion.